Hello students and welcome to the lecture. So students, as we know that we are covering the parliament and basically these are the topics that we have scheduled for the discussion under this particular series. And if we talk about the topics that we have covered so far, so we have done with introduction, organization of parliament, composition of two houses, system of elections to Lok Sabha, duration of two houses, membership of parliament, presiding officers of parliament, leaders in parliament, sessions of parliament, the devices of parliamentary proceedings, that's city process in parliament, and the joint sitting of two houses. Okay, so these are the topics that we have covered so far. If we talk about the topic on which we have been discussing on, so we have been discussing on the budget in parliament, and the topics that are remaining, these are the multifunction role of parliament, ineffectiveness of parliamentary control, position of Rajya Sabha, parliamentary privileges, and the sovereignty of parliament. All right, so this is the picture that we have created so far altogether. So basically now we will start from where we had left in the previous lecture. Okay, so these are the things that I had told you contained in the budget, and we know in you can say the constitution there is nothing like a budget. Basically there is a word that we call as an annual financial statement, right? And this is mentioned under article 112. Okay, so we had discussed that basically in the constitution there is a term annual financial statement, article 112. Okay, and we had discussed that basically the AFS or this particular thing you can say, this could only be presented in the Lok Sabha, okay, by the finance minister. All right, and these are the things that are contained here, like what is the estimation of the revenue and the capital received by the government. Okay, how the government is going to raise the revenue, the ways and the means they are going to employ, how much the government is willing to spend in this particular financial year, what were the estimated expenditure and the receipts in comparison with the actual expenditure and the receipt in the previous year, and if there is any deficit then the government is required to answer it. If there was any surplus then the government is required to mention the reasons. And last is economic and financial policy of the coming year, that is taxation proposals, prospects of revenue, spending program, and introduction of new schemes and projects. Okay, so these all are basically the content of the annual financial statement. Got it? Now let's move forward. So basically there is a one thing, like before starting here, let us recall several things first. Okay, so what was that? We are you can say talking about the budget, when the budget was come, okay, what are the things and this all. But here is one thing that we discuss first, all right, and that is Government of India Act 1858. And why I am saying this? Because you know that when we were discussing about the history of the Indian Constitution, okay, like how did the Indian Constitution framed out. So when we were discussing about it, there was a one thing that I had told you, that was the revolt of 1857, right? That was the revolt of 1857. Okay, and after this revolt, the one thing that we had seen there was that the British government decided that they should take over the power from East India Company to British Crown. All right, now most of you will say that was already done. Okay, that was already done in the 1813 Charter Act. Like the power was already took from the East India Company, but not the full power. In the 1813 Charter Act, only there was a division happened between the financial and administrative powers. Okay, but in the Government of India Act 1858, the entire powers, whether it's military, it's financial, it's administration, entire powers were taken over by the British Crown. All right, and then the British Crown assumed the direct control over the India. After this, what happened? That was the year of 1860. Okay, that was the year of 1860 when first budget came. Okay, 2 years after the Government of India Act, when the financial and economical powers were also taken by the British Crown, then in 1860 the first budget came to the country. Okay, and basically we can say the detailed form was came in 1869. Okay, in 1869 by James Wilson. Okay, James Wilson was the, you can say, the financial advisor to the Council of Viceroy of India. Okay, and we know the position of Viceroy was introduced in the Government of India Act 1858. That is what we had already discussed in the detail form. So I'm not going to discuss it right now here. All right, but I tried to connect it with the points so that you could recall it and you would be able to connect it with the current scenario. Okay, so that was a thing. After this, what happened? There was a time period of 1947, and we know this was a time period when India got independent. Okay, during this year, another thing was happened, and what was that? Basically, for the first time, the division was introduced in the independent India. That was interim railway budget and then general budget. Okay, it means that whatsoever the spending and the revenue the government is going to show, they would show it with the interim railway expenditure and the revenue and the general budget. It means that other prospects other than the railway. Okay, that was the things. So from 1947 till 2017, okay, the Government of India had two budgets. Like I have told you, the railway budget and the general budget. Okay, the railway budget and the general budget. Okay, so if we talk about them, while the former consisted of the estimated receipts of the railway and the expenditure of only the Ministry of Railways. Okay, the later consists of the estimates of receipts and the expenditure of all the ministries of the Government of India except the railway. Okay, the similar thing that I have told you, in the railway budget only the government talk about the railways, but in general budgets government talk about all the issues other than the railways. All right, but here is one thing also, like we could say here, the railway budget was separated from the general budget in 1924 for the first time during the British era on the recommendations of the Ackworth Committee Report 1921. Okay, so remember, if we match it with this statement, so do not get confused. Why? Because basically the separation between the railway budget and the general budget, that was not introduced by the Indians, that was introduced by the Britishers. Okay, then in 1947 there was a person whose name was John Mathai, Okay, he was the finance minister of the independence India. Okay, he was the one who continued it. Okay, so remember that Indians were not the originators of the division. Okay, they were the carrier on. Okay, the carriers, you can say. The reason or objectives of these separations were as follows. The first, to introduce the flexibility in the railway finance. Like if we compare the Britishers in India with the Indian government, or you can say independent Indian government, so their motives were different. Why? Because if we take the case of the Britishers, so why did the Britishers were emphasizing on the railway development? Because their intentions were very much clear. They want to spread out the railways so that their military movement could be ensured, their trading movements could be ensured. All right, and then even they could earn from the revenue from the government, or sorry, from the Indians. Okay, because in the 90s, when we are talking about the 20th century, during that time Indians were using the railways. Okay, and they were paying the money which is going to the Britishers. Why? Because prior to this, when the Britishers had introduced the several laws, several taxation policies, basically those policies got failed and they had to face the revolt from the Indians. So railway was the source for them from which they were earning without any, you can say, the revolting situation and all right, so that was the thing. If we talk about the independent government of India, so basically we emphasized on the spreading of railways so that we could not only earn the revenues but also we would provide the facilities to the countrymen. Okay, so that was the first thing, to introduce the flexibility in the railway finance, because railway finance had the different demands in comparison with the general budgets, and if the emphasization would be on the general budget, so the railway would get a less amount. Second reason was to facilitate a business approach to the railway policies, like I had told you. Okay, even in this, let me tell you one thing. Basically, the Britishers had introduced the railways bond. Okay, what was that? So when the Britishers were, you can say, spreading the railways throughout the country, all right, they needed a finance. Okay, they needed a finance so that they could spend on the railways. For this purpose, basically they issued the railway bonds, which is very much like the today's bonds. Okay, like today's bond, we know the organization which is issuing the bonds, for example, the XYZ. Suppose they are issuing some bond of rupees 10 lakh. So, whosoever will purchase this bond, okay, the person is required to pay rupees 10 lakhs to the XYZ for a certain time period. For example, the tenure of 1 year. Okay, then after some time, what will happen? The XYZ will return the amount to the person who had purchased it, and the person would return the bond to the XYZ. But here is one question. If the person purchased the bond, so what is the profit of him? What did he get? Okay, basically he would get the interest rates. All right, on the fixed time basis. For example, if the XYZ said whosoever will purchase this bond, so the person would get 10% interest rate. Okay, per annum you can say. So the tenure for 1 year. So when the XYZ would return the amount, they would not only return the 10 lakh rupees, but they would return the 11 lakh rupees. Why? Because the 10% of 10 lakh is 1 lakh. So the interest would be add on to the principal amount. Okay. So the XYZ would get the finance. this 10 lakh rupees to use in the operations, and the person who had purchased it will get the interest full amount. So basically that concept was employed during the spreading of railways by the Britishers. So they were also introduced the railway bonds. Okay, in railway bonds, basically the Britishers, or you can say the European companies, basically the European companies and traders, also the Indian traders could purchase the railway bonds. Okay, but yes, it's obvious that the Britishers were favoring the European companies. Why? Because the interest rates that were given to the European companies were much higher in comparison with the Indian traders. Okay, but that was the thing. So basically, how much interest the Britishers would give to the one who would purchase the railway bonds, that would also mention in the railway budgets. Okay, so basically there was a business approach to the railway policies by the Britishers. All right. After this, to secure the stability of the general revenues by providing an assured annual contribution from railway revenues. All right, it means that whatsoever the government would earn from the railway, that would be utilized in the railways, and if the amount remains, then this would be add on to the general revenues, so that this could be used for other purposes also. Okay, and the last one was to enable the railways to keep their profits for their own development, like I had told you. Okay, the railways needed a high amount of investment. Okay, and other prospects were also there. So basically, if we mix them up, so there was a issue of giving more, giving less. Okay, so to balance this approach, basically railways got separated, and then railways kept the inability to keep their profits for their own development. It means that they are required to pay the fixed annual contribution to the general revenues that could be used for the general budget. All right, and the remaining one would be exclusively utilized in the railways development. Okay, so these were some of the key objectives for the separation that was introduced by the Ackworth Committee in 1921, implemented in 1924. In 1947, Mr. John Mathai, who was the finance minister of independent India, he continued it, but in 2017, the Indian government repealed the provision, and then the railway and the general budget got merged together. Got it? So this is the timeline that you are required to keep in your mind. Okay, and this is a thing that we had seen, that in 2017 the central government merged the railway budget into the general budget. Hence there is now only one budget for the government of India, that is known as the union budget. Okay, the separation like the railway and the general budget is no longer existed. After this, now let's talk about the constitutional provisions of the budget. Okay, like how does the constitution provides the ways and means through which the budget could be presented, the debate could be organized, voting would be ensured, and the passing of the budget. So the Constitution of India contains the following provision with regard to the enactment of the budget. Enactment of the budget. Okay, first is, the President shall, in respect of every financial year, cause to be laid before both the houses of Parliament a statement of estimated receipt and expenditure of the Government of India for that year. Okay, so who will first give the presentation? The President of India. Okay, no demand for a grant shall be made except on the recommendations of the President. Like President would introduce the House that the government is going to spend that much of the amount, and that is their estimated revenue. What is the meaning of demand for grant? Basically, different ministries and different departments got a different allotment of the revenues, the reserves and the funds. Okay, so the houses are required to approve the demand of that particular ministry and department regarding that amount which has been mentioned in the budget. So basically, demand for a grant is the voting processor. For example, suppose if there is any XYZ ministry, okay, they called for rupees 10 crore to spend and they promised that they would earn rupees 12 crore from it. Okay, so this is their demand and this is their promise. So basically the voting would be organized in the houses that should this organization XYZ got the 10 crores or not. Alright, so there is a thing. After this, no money shall be withdrawn from the consolidated fund of India except under the appropriation made by law. Okay, the consolidated fund of India is like a bank account to the government of India. All the expenditures done from here, all the revenues come to it. All right, so basically it works as an bank account for the government. All right, so to withdraw this money, the government is required to make the proper appropriation of law. Until or unless the government does this, the government could not withdraw any amount from it. Okay, thereafter, no money bill imposing taxes shall be introduced in the parliament except on the recommendation of the president, and such a bill shall not be introduced in the Rajya Sabha. All right, like we had discussed, the money bill could only be introduced in the house after the prior recommendations of the president, or you can say the prior consent of. Okay, and this could only be presented in the Lok Sabha. That's why it is written down that it could not be or it shall not be introduced in the Rajya Sabha. All right, so these are the things. Now let's move forward. No tax shall be levied or collected except by the authority of law. Okay, it means that there must be some enactment of law which would prescribe for the levying of the taxes and the collection of the taxes. Okay, so that the person to whom the tax is chargeable will pay the exact charging amount. There should no discrimination in levying or collection of the taxes by the government. So that's why proper law is required with the mentioning of entire provisions. So this discrimination and the corruption cases could be controlled. After this, the parliament can reduce or abolish a tax but cannot increase it. Okay. After this, the constitution has also defined the relative roles or position of both the houses of parliament with regard to the enactment of the bill in the following way. Like, what are the ways? Let's see. First way is a money bill or finance bill dealing with the taxation cannot be introduced in the Rajya Sabha, must be introduced only in the Lok Sabha. That is, we had already discussed. Thereafter, the Rajya Sabha has no power to vote on the demand for grants. It is the exclusive privilege of the Lok Sabha. Like, demand for grants could be made in respect of the money bill or the finance bill. All right, and basically these will could only be exclusively introduced in the Lok Sabha. All right, so basically the Rajya Sabha having no power to vote for the demands for grants, they could only discuss it and suggested the recommendations. And remember, here I am also saying you, they could only suggesting the recommendations or the amendments. They could not made it by themselves. Why? Because the exclusive privilege of the money bill vests with the Lok Sabha and Lok Sabha only. All right. After this, Rajya Sabha should return the money bill or the French bill to the Lok Sabha within the time period of 14 days that we had already discussed. Okay, and this is totally depend upon the will of the Lok Sabha, whether they want to accept the recommendations made by the Rajya Sabha or they want to reject the recommendations made by the Rajya Sabha. Okay, the Lok Sabha could not be forced, could not be directed for accepting and rejecting the recommendations made by the Rajya Sabha in this regard. After this, the estimates of expenditures embodied in the budget shall show separately the expenditure charged on the Constituent Fund of India and the expenditure made from the Constituent Fund of India. Okay, it means that we can say there are two types of expenditures from the Constituent Fund of India. expenditure charged and the expenditure made. What is the meaning of this? So expenditure on charge is the expenditure that could not be discussed in the Lok Sabha and no voting could be held, like the salaries and allowances of the Supreme Court judges, Election Commission, Comptroller and Auditor General, okay, Central Vigilance Commissioners and all. Alright, so these expenditures are fixed and these could not be discussed and put for voting in the parliament. While the expenditure made is the expenditure that could be discussed, okay, and that could be voted, alright, in the Lok Sabha. So that's why there is a provision that these two estimates should not be merged together. Alright, they must be presented separately so the exact amount could be known to the House members and then they could proceed it with the clarity. Alright, the budget shall distinguish expenditure on the revenue account from other expenditure. Alright, 10th point, the expenditure charged on the Consolidated Fund of India shall not be submitted to the vote of Parliament. The same thing I have told you. However, it can be discussed by the Parliament, alright, but in a restricted way. Alright. So here is the charge expenditure. Let's discuss it in detail form. The budget consists of two types of expenditure. Charge upon the Consolidated Fund of India and made from the Consolidated Fund of India. Alright, the charge expenditure is non-votable by the Parliament. That is, it can only be discussed by the Parliament, while the other type has to be voted by the Parliament. And what types of expenditure comes under this category? I have told you, like the salaries and allowances of the constitutional bodies, alright, and any particular body which has been granted the charge expenditure capacity by the Parliament of India. Alright. The list of the charge expenditure is as follows. The first is emoluments and allowances of the President and other expenditure relating to his office. Thereafter, the salaries and allowances of the Chairman and the Deputy Chairman of Rajya Sabha and the Speaker and the Deputy Speaker of the Lok Sabha. Then, salaries and allowances and pensions of the judges of the Supreme Court. Then, pensions of the judges of high courts. Then the salaries, allowances and pensions of the Comptroller and Auditor General of India. Alright, here the salaries of the judges of high court not included because it is not chargeable on the Consolidated Fund of India. It is chargeable on the Consolidated Fund of the state. Okay, but the pensions are charged on the Consolidated Fund of India. Alright. Thereafter, the salaries, allowances and pension of the chairman and the members of Union Public Service Commission, the administrative expenses of the Supreme Court, the office of the Comptroller and Auditor General of India, the Union Public Service Commission including the salaries, allowances, pensions of the person serving in these offices. The debt charges for which the Government of India is liable, including the interest, sinking fund charges and redemption charges and other expenditures relating to the raising of loans and the service and redemption of the debt. Okay. Thereafter, any sum required to satisfy any judgment, decree or award of any court or arbitral tribunal. Thereafter, last is any other expenditure declared by the Parliament to be so charged. Alright, so basically these all are the elements that are chargeable on the Consolidated Fund of India. So students, basically in this lecture we have finished till here. In the next lecture we would continue from here. Till then, just revise the facts and figures that all we have discussed in this lecture and be ready for the another lecture. With this note, let's end this lecture, and what we say thank you.